My name's Margaret Crockett, and I want to welcome you all to the ICA online workshops 2021, and in particular the one you're all here for today, WIDH at ICA 2021, an introduction to digital humanities. And I'm now going to hand over to David Risley, who is going to introduce himself and his colleagues and the workshop. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Margaret. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm so excited to see such an interesting and wide-ranging group of people from around the world. I'm really happy to get to know you today in the course of today's workshop. I'm going to just share my slides in order to start. I did share with each and every one of you a link to your email that has the slides. So if you'd like to see those slides on another device or be able to look at them at your own leisure or not have them projected on Zoom, they're there for you. And as we go along today, we will add the rest of the slides from the other presenters in due course. So I'm just going to share my screen. What we're going to do for the first 15 minutes or so is to have a little introduction to today's workshop. So my name is David Risley, and I'm Associate Professor of Digital Humanities at New York University, Abu Dhabi. I've been living in the Middle East for about 20 years now, 5 of which have been in Abu Dhabi. Before that, I was at the American University of Beirut. And I'm very interested in a combination of topics in digital humanities, including textual humanities, spatial humanities, and along with my colleague, who I'm going to introduce to you right now, Beth Russell, we've put together what you're going to hear about in this first session, the WIDH, the Winter Institute in Digital Humanities at NYU Abu Dhabi. Beth, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, David. Hi, everyone. And yes, thank you to Margaret and ICA for having us here today. I'm Beth Russell. I'm the Associate Director for Research Services and Strategy and Associate Academic Librarian for the Humanities at NYU Abu Dhabi's library. I partner with faculty research projects and programs in digital humanities, and I also oversee the library's programs involving research services, collections, and digital scholarship, and collaborate routinely on issues of digital storage and digital archiving. And as David mentioned, I'm also the co-founder of the Winter Institute.
So we've been working together, faculty member and librarian, for now 5 years and on a lot of different topics in getting digital humanities going in our institution, getting it in, diversifying it, having different people be involved in it. In particular, we've done a lot with undergraduates at our institution. Our institution is largely an undergraduate institution, and so on the way to having graduate studies, but we've done a lot with undergraduate courses. And we've been trying in many different ways to engage with the various communities. Digital humanities is not in the Middle East, it's not the first place you think about digital humanities. Yet there are very interesting pockets of communities and researchers who are really coming forward and doing some really interesting work. So we're really excited today to welcome you to our community.
David, do we have our slides shared?
Do you not have your slides shared? I'm sorry if I apologize. Let me just double check and make sure it's the right one. Let me share back. How about that? Does everyone see the slides? I think so. Okay, they are shared now, yes.
Okay.
You're on slide 4.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, great, sure. So first we'd like to start off with giving you a bit of background information on where we come from, NYU Abu Dhabi, which some of you may not be familiar with. We're located in Abu Dhabi, which is the capital of the United Arab Emirates, which is not Dubai, which is 45 minutes down the road from us. NYU Abu Dhabi is one of 3 of NYU's global campuses, with New York and Shanghai being the other 2. The university opened our temporary campus in downtown Abu Dhabi in 2010 with 150 students, so just a tiny little class to start. And we now have over 1,600 students and will eventually grow to 2,500 graduate and undergraduate students. We have over 300 faculty, and we are a full liberal arts and research university representing the sciences, engineering, social sciences, arts, and humanities. Our first master's programs in economics and fine arts were recently launched, and we have plans to grow our graduate and PhD programs even more so in the near future. And our students are very global. They come from over 115 countries, and we have nearly as many languages spoken on campus. And we are in our permanent home now, which we moved to in 2014. We're located on Saudi Island with the museum and culture sector only a few kilometers away, which includes our neighbors, the Louvre, and soon to be the Guggenheim and Zayed National Museum.
So what I wanted to do, just because this is today an introduction to digital humanities, is to offer you a temporary definition of what that actually means. So of course, it's a big field. It actually encompasses different kinds of practices across many different disciplines and also the interdisciplines between those. But basically, if you think about digital humanities, one of the things that comes to mind is where people are bringing together the digital or some form of technology or computation with objects of the human record. So the kind of things that we have in our libraries, archives, and museums. Also, one of the things that is built into digital humanities is a reflection on how the human record changes, or how even our understanding of the human record changes once we digitize it. The third point that I put up here is a building of new understandings of that human record. So understanding, interpreting, reshaping, remaking that record. And finally, exploring innovative ways to create content today. And I think that's one of the things we're going to be talking about in each of the presentations that we have, is how we can do different things now once we have the digital. And so finally, what is a Windsor Institute in Digital Humanities? Well, it's an opportunity to come together. It's a community, it's a social event. It's an opportunity to come together and to explore and to learn more about each of those 4 points that we mentioned above. So with the digital, all kinds of new questions arise in our work. And I just have some questions here on the screen that I'm going to read aloud. And I hope that what we'll do is, in the course of today's conversations and breakout rooms after the presentations, we'll explore some of these together. So first of all, how do professional standards change when archives become digital? Second, how does the digital change what scholars and communities can do? And we don't have the word together, but you could say can do together. Third, how do digital humanities inform future projects within archives? And fourth, how does the digital change your professional and ethical commitments? So again, I hope we'll come back to those as a way of thinking through some of the implications of digital humanities for the worlds in which you work. You're muted, Beth.
Zoom faux pas. As some of you may be aware, there are a variety of digital humanities training institutes located all around the world, and we've represented a few of these here, including Digital Humanities at Oxford, the Digital Humanities Institute at Beirut, which David founded, DHSI in Victoria, Canada, which is one of the most well-known, and several others. And we've obviously by no means represented all of them here. So we do welcome your feedback on any others that you might be aware of, which you can put in the chat box, and then we can add them to our slide later. Moving on to the next slide. In this slide, we wanted to give you some context as to why David and I are here today facilitating a session on DH as part of the ICA. This event is a continuation of the event that we mentioned before, our Winter Institute in Digital Humanities, that David and I co-founded in 2020, January 2020. During that first in-person event, we had over 100 international participants and instructors join us in person in Abu Dhabi for a multi-day DH training event on the Abu Dhabi campus. And David and I had always planned at the time on WID becoming an annual in-person gathering, but right after that inaugural event, this little thing called COVID came into our lives right as we were wrapping up and caused us to pivot our programming. So since then, we've had to pivot what we've done. So what you've seen on this, or what you see on this slide, is our trajectory of WID as we've moved it to a virtual setting over the past nearly 2 years. Offering smaller events such as DH meetups via Zoom, embedding ourselves in NYC's DH week last January or February, I think it was. And our session today with at ICA is just a continuation of our work together. And we hope to slowly shift the Winter Institute back to in-person programming in the very near future. And then on the next slide here, we just listed out some of the Winter Institute courses that we've had over the past few years, both in person and virtual. For example, Python for humanities research, data in and of the humanities, cybersecurity for humanists, text analysis of Arabic, which was one of our most popular, using Google Sheets, archiving web content, which might be of particular interest to this group. We are sure to archive all of our information about all of our different Winter Institute events on the website that you see listed up there. So wp.nyu.edu/WID. So feel free to check that out.
Digital humanities training in Abu Dhabi is different than digital humanities training in India, or digital humanities training in Canada or in South America. Lots of people on the call come from lots of different places in the world. And one of the interesting things about our particular place in Abu Dhabi, as Beth mentioned, with our student population and also our faculty and staff population, is that we also come from many different places in the world. So one of the things we are trying to do in our particular context is acknowledge that we are an Arab country, of course, but we're also a highly cosmopolitan, multilingual, mobile society with people coming from lots of different places. So on the one hand, we did have lots of interest in our Arabic text processing class, and I think that is a logical thing, given that we are in Abu Dhabi. But we're not trying to make our particular brand, if you like, of digital humanities training be only about Arabic, but to be at not really operating in any particular cultural horizon, specific cultural horizon, but trying to think about how digital humanities at this global crossroads university, as we often call ourselves, what that might actually look like. So one of the things that's actually really important about the people who are here is that because they come from many different places in the world, and many of those places in the world are not Western places, or these people are studying topics that are not Western topics, we've discovered that we have a distinctly non-Western focus in much of our community's work and archives. And so I think you'll see today that many of the presentations that we have today will actually touch on methods or approaches that are not language specific, right? Or are actually language agnostic or language independent, can move off in different directions. And I think this is a very important part of the kind of work that we do, because when you go to, let's say, a DH training in Slovenia or one in Russia, one of the characteristics you would find in that place is usually a very strong focus on language and the specificities of language in that particular part of the world. On the other hand, we really do also try to acknowledge that in our region itself and amongst the people where we're coming, we have really wide range of access to infrastructure and a significant amount of infrastructural equity. And this is important because when we think about what we can do in some environments, the skills, let's say, the techniques, the methods that you might be able to carry out in one place do not automatically translate to other places. And so one of the things we try to have our instructors do is to focus on techniques and methods in the digital humanities that are as open as possible, and that invite a wide variety of contexts into their understanding and their development. Now, of course, because we are in a place where we are really developing our environment, that archival landscape that is also in development, we understand the difficulties of bringing about and pulling together and making digital humanities happen. So we have a code of conduct, and that idea of the code of conduct is to bring people together, and we apply that code of conduct in person as well as in virtual events to make sure that everybody is not assuming that everyone else is on the same page as they are. This is an attempt at being as inclusive and as open to as many people as possible. And finally, if you're interested in joining our mailing list, it's not a very heavy flow of mail, but every once in a while we have some notifications, some things that we, some activities that are going on.
And on this slide here, it's just a quick overview of our schedule for today's session. So we have our introduction now, and then right after this, we'll launch right into David's session on mapping collections. And after that, we'll have a brief break, and then we'll move on to Estelle's session on research image data. After that, we'll have another quick break so we can stretch our legs, and then we'll move into Sufan's session with handwritten text recognition. And then another short break, and then Carol Kyoto from Harvard will wrap it up with her talk on images as data. And then after all four of the sessions have wrapped up, we'll come together as a group just for a general discussion to share our thoughts and ideas about what we've discussed and learned about today, and a little bit of networking as well, and then we'll wrap it up. David and I will each be moderating these sessions, so feel free to paste any questions that you might have into the chat box, and we can read those out for you, or raise your virtual hand and contribute to the discussion as well. We anticipate each instructor will speak for a portion of their time and then leave time for questions after that.
So one of the things that I'd like to leave you with are some archival objects. And this is a kind of a, if you like, supposed to stimulate a little bit of our imagination. And the question we have here on the slide is, what does a community do with objects? On the left-hand side, we have a whole bunch of old photographs that have been collected. In the middle, we have an old media form, the cassette tape that no doubt many of you have seen or have piled up in closets at your home. We have cassettes. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we have a pile of phone books on a library cart. So of course, all of our communities have these kinds of objects. The question, of course, becomes, is what do they do with these objects? Do they collect them in a closet? Do they throw them away? Do they digitize them? Well, each one of these categories, the old photographs, the cassette tapes, and the old phone books, actually gave rise to digital scholarship at NYU Abu Dhabi. And so I'd like to just hold that thought also about what do you do with these objects, and we can have a little bit more of a conversation about that in our general conversation. So I just would like to welcome you all to the workshop today, and we really hope that all of you enjoy today's workshop. We have on the call today Supan Kirmazaltan, Carol Kyoto, Estelle Geville, myself, and Beth Russell, and we'll go in turn. So I'm going to just take 1 second to share my new slides. Give me just one second, and then we'll start with the first session, which is my session called Mapping Collections. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again with those slides. So my topic today is called Mapping Collections. I happen to be very interested in the map as a way of collating information, of representing information, and eventually analyzing and creating explorable spaces for communities to do the same. So in my presentation today, I'm going to look at this question of maps. And of course, we know that collections which have been digitized or even partially digitized, very often what we want to do is contextualize them. right? And so if we've digitized them, one of the ways that we learn to do in digital humanities, we learn to manipulate those digitized collections in different ways to contextualize them and to make them more user-friendly or make them more understandable by different kinds of people. So we're going to see different examples in today's workshop of this phenomenon from different participants. We're going to see optical character recognition. We're going to see linking and describing digitized photos, even computationally analyzing photos. I'm going to be speaking, though, about another way of visualizing items in a collection, and that is by putting them on a map. So mapping helps in providing context for collections, in telling a story about the collections, maybe facilitating collection discovery by different publics, even just drawing attention to a collection amongst a larger public, or for that matter, building a companion map to an exhibition that you have. I'm not sure if everyone on the screen, if everyone on the call today knows this recent Netflix series. It just came out in October 2021. It's a German Netflix series called The $1 Billion Code. And The $1 Billion Code is it's a series about a bunch of hackers who are working in 1990s Berlin. In particular, I think it takes place in 1993. And the parallel story of this is a trial that took place in 2017 between these hackers and Google. And of course, the idea here is that what they did was they kind of created, or they told the story of the creation of what they called a planet viewer or a planet browser, which is actually what they claim is what Google stole from them, has now become Google Earth. And so this idea of the emergence of Google Earth, a way of getting at information using a map or browsing around the planet, is so naturalized today. We so understand, it's just such a part of our daily lives that it's hard to remember in some ways a day when that didn't actually exist. But what I put on the screen here are some interesting samples of a conversation that's taking place between the hackers in 1993 and someone from Silicon Graphics, it was called, from Silicon Valley, who came to Germany. And so they were saying, right now, Silicon Graphics is just an image on a satellite map. And then they said, but if you could fill TeraVision with content, it could become a portal to a database. So in this kind of thought, there was already this idea of a map somehow being an access point for getting to information. On the right-hand side, you see that the main hacker, who's a Hungarian, saying, in the future, you could go to a virtual school or a virtual university. You could go to a virtual museum and see the artworks. So what I love about these slides, these small screen captures from the $1 Billion Code, is this imagination in the early 1990s about using spatial representation as a way of gaining access to cultural heritage materials. So what I'm going to be talking about today in the presentation is what some people have called the geographies of information. So we all know that some library metadata are already spatial, right? But in order for us to use them and make them work as a map, what we have to do is to translate them into coordinates or into linked data. So what I'd like to make the claim for you today is that mapping a collection helps us grasp the complex spatial dimension of documents. It's a technique for unflattening. This is the term that Nick Souzanis uses. Knowledge and archives are constructed of a sample document from the Qatar Digital Library on the right-hand side. This is a document that has information about Persian Gulf air routes, air facilities at Yas Island and at Abu Dhabi. And so in the related search terms, you find something like Sir Beni Yas, which is an island in the western part of the Abu Dhabi Emirate of Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. And we can translate that into something like latitude and longitude, right, with decimal points, and that helps us put something on a map. But we can also connect that, link that up to other descriptions, canonical descriptions that exist on the web, something like a geonames ID or a Q number at Wikidata. And so that idea that we can move from what we already have in archival metadata, library metadata, to something that it works in the digital environment is what I'd like to explore with you today. So there's a few projects I'd like to just show you. One of my first ones that I absolutely love is the Disquaire de Paris. This is a great project which actually locates vinyl stores. If you remember vinyl as an old media in Paris from the 1890s until 1962. And so what it does is it collates location with miscellanea, with photos from a private collection, someone who was interested in these vinyl stores. And as you move around the map and you hover over the map, you can get the addresses and places that used to be in Paris. If you click on them, particularly on the blue ones, you get some new information and you get a kind of sidebar that shows up with photos. So this map helps us appreciate the spaces of in an urban environment for vinyl, for an old media form, their rise and their fall, because of course you'll see that there's also a time slider. And so the time slider allows us to kind of move and to see over a particular point of time how those neighborhoods actually changed in the city. The second project that I'd like to propose to you is called Mapping Philippine Material Culture. And this is a kind of visual inventory of Filipiniana, so objects of material culture or museum objects associated with the Philippines or having come from the Philippines that are actually now in museums and private collections outside the Philippines. And so this map is an interesting one in the sense where you have items, you have a map above, which you have these kind of clusters of numbers, and these show the number of places in the world where you actually have these, and below you get some access to those items. So working with a map like this, kind of an academic enterprise, right? A little bit less popular than the first one, perhaps for a more specialized audience, but allows us to appreciate how material objects of material culture have been scattered around the world, informing and giving some interesting data to debates about post-colonial museum studies. And the third example that I'd like to give you of a mapping project that deals with collections is that of Photogrammer. Photogrammer is made by a colleague and dear friend and a team from Yale who did really interesting work of bringing together 170,000 photographs taken in the early part of the 20th century by the Farm Security Administration, the Office of War Information. So what is a large archive of photographs from a particular time, place and time are again collated. They're sort of organized here so that you can explore them by the different aspects. So on the bottom right hand, you see a list of different photographers, excuse me. And as you click on those particular photographers, what you get are then different sized circles that show up on the map. So effectively what an interface like this does is it helps us to understand something about not just the archive as a flat object, but it helps us understand the space and the time of the archive. It helps us understand where the photographers came from, where they moved, and you can put different sets of photographers together and see those photographs. And that helps us. It's a kind of a finding aid. It's an interpretive aid, right, to a collection. Now, these three projects that I mentioned for you, Disquaire de Paris, Mapping Philippine Material Culture, and Photogrammer, were built by whole groups of people. They were built by archivists, by developers, by lots of people who were really interested, obviously, in having their collections become available to people. But that fact of working having so many people working together at the same time means that they took a lot of time and a lot of energy to make these happen. And some of these projects have actually gone through multiple iterations. So if you look at this and you're a new person coming to an introduction to digital humanities workshop, you have to ask yourself, how would I do something like this? Like, how would I go about creating something like this in my own environment? Well, the easy answer is that it's not an easy endeavor. It actually takes a considerable amount of time. There's a whole long process. But one of the ways that you begin, and when I teach digital humanities, one of the ways you begin to learn is by exploring and understanding the way other people have done this and the way that other people have built upon what are already practices that they have in their own profession to build and to build slowly, sometimes even, right, based on a learning process, both themselves and people inside of their organizations. So the next couple slides I have are kind of dedicated to the idea of learning for yourself, right? One of the things I think that's really important about digital humanities is that it's a field in which you have to constantly learn new things. And you don't just hire people to do digital humanities for you. I guess you can, but I wouldn't suggest that. You don't just also you use only what you know right now, but there's like a whole process of learning. So let's take these examples of these maps that we just looked at, and let's think about how you might learn to do this. So I teach with Dr. Randall Khatib, a former student and colleague. I teach a course at the European Summer University for Digital Humanities, where also Dr. Carol Kyoto teaches, and many of our other colleagues. And so we come together in the summertime for a period of 10 days or so. And this is actually not unlike the Winter Institute in Digital Humanities in Abu Dhabi, just a summer version in Germany, where we go where the weather is nice in both in each place. But in that workshop, actually, you can learn in 10 days in a stepwise manner to make a map in which you have pop-up boxes in which metadata appear and images corresponding to those things appear. And when you show this to somebody at the beginning of the 10 days, they don't quite believe that that's actually possible, right? They don't quite believe that they could actually get to that point. But in fact, what we do is we break that down into a whole series of steps. So for example, the first part of that is about learning to manage your images, learning to understand what are the things that you actually want to represent on the screen, on the map. And so in fact, that process we're going to learn a little bit about today from Tropy, about Tropy, which is a tool that Estelle Gavil is going to present to us. And then we learn how to build and construct metadata that correspond to each of those, that allow us somehow to see different aspects of the things on the screen. The second step of that is we have to learn a little bit about digital mapping in order for that to occur. And there we learn just a little bit, if you're familiar with the idea of GIS or Geographic Information Service systems, things like ArcGIS or QGIS, we learn some very basic manipulations in those that allow us to bring that information into ever so much closer to that digital environment. And then we learn the third step there that we learn is about learning how to web publish. And actually all three of these skills, managing one's data, preparing it and mapping it and getting it ready and then publishing to the web, each of those pieces are challenging and they require us to learn new things, right? But it's that process of beginning to dive in and learn small bits and then put those together in workflows that allow us to create, that digital humanities for me is largely about. And those are challenging things. They're new things, and they're certainly not something that we went to school and we learned. So here, just to give you a small example of some of the maps that were made, some of the prototype maps, if you like, that were made by complete amateurs in my class. These were mostly graduate students, PhD students. So we had one student who was interested in music and the places of music in Milan, Italy. And so he went and collected, he actually lives in Milan. And so as the course was going along, he was out there taking pictures of everything that he wanted. So he had that. And then in the middle, on the bottom, an Orientalist student studying Arabic studies, who's interested in different places where you can, different places where landscapes of the Arabian Peninsula were depicted. So this is actually, it's a panoramic view of the city of Mecca, but it was made in Vienna. And so she's interested in this kind of the spatial representation, the spatial spatiality of those images. And in the upper right-hand corner was another graduate student who did something about sites of archaeological importance in Persia. And so from a small amount of visual material, knowing the kind of metadata that one can add to those particular pictures, students were able to build these relatively quickly. So let's say you want to do this yourself. What would you need? Well, you need an idea about what you hold, perhaps in your own collections or on your own hard drive or in your own spaces that have a spatial element to it. You need some time to collect the metadata. And that's, as we know, is not a fast activity. You need some time to locate these in space and structure this information. And then you need a little bit of know-how, like a course, like a spatial humanities course, or the one that I taught, of how to organize that process within your organization. There's a lot of questions that come about when you start working on this, like how many, what would I do? What do I need to digitize? What do I need to prepare? Do I want to work on this together? Do I want to work on this with other people? Do I want to use this to engage the public? So if we move back out a little bit to what some other interesting, some libraries and some archives in the world have done with spatial information, I just like to bring up just a couple of examples to show you what some of the larger possibilities are. So this kind of, if you're familiar with the idea of crowdsourcing, right? Crowdsourcing is the idea of crowdsourcing is getting a group of people to do work for you. There's actually an old project that was done in 2012, the Royal Pavilion and Museums of Brighton and Hove in the UK, in which they actually asked people on a web interface, can you locate in the city the objects in our museum? And the crowd went about doing that. And what they ended up with is not a map of the museum itself, but the objects that are represented in that museum, where they actually sit in the city. The French National Library has a really interesting little tool called Htr, which you see here, a nice little map, a photograph in their collections of two elephants walking around in a garden in the city of Paris at some point of the past. It looks like late part of the 19th century. But the idea here is, can you put this on a map? Can you drop a pin on the map and help us to understand where that actually sits? And they've actually had some really interesting luck with that, and some interesting luck with some collections, so much so that when you go to their library catalog and you look for some things, sometimes you get this little world sign. And what that means is that we know what this represents. And for some collections, like the collection, the photographs that were atelier, we get an amazing map of all the spaces in the city where he was actually focused on in his work, which again gives us that kind of insight, that contextualization into what was going on. The final example I'd like to show you is actually when people open up not just to library catalogs, but to the Wikiverse in general. And this is an example, a very interesting example of Wikidata, where someone has taken Wikidata and it's called the Painted Planet. And the idea here is what kinds of places in the world are actually represented in Wikidata. And you can go through and look and see and then filter by country, and different ones show up on the map. But the map becomes a way of interrogating that. So what I'd like to do in the breakout session is we're going to put everybody into random rooms. So based on the conversation that I just had, the very, very quick introduction to mapping collections, I have one of two questions for you. And so I'm going to let you choose in your room what you'd like to do. The first question is, can you think of something in one of your collections that you'd like to spatialize? And what I mean by that is something you'd like to put on a map. And how would putting on a map, how would that attract attention in your environment? Another possible thing that you could do in your group, and I'm going to let you decide, let the group decide, is explore one of those maps, the Philippine Studies map, or maybe the Painted Planet one, and see what you discover from it, and what it has how it maybe captures some interest in your own, in those collections for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you about 10 minutes. And we're going to let you go off into some rooms together. What I would like you to do is, in your room, choose a reporter who can come back and give us maybe one interesting point that came about from your discussion. Thanks very much for your attention. We're going to give you now 10 minutes to go off into a group, and we'll come back for a general discussion for a few minutes more before we pass on to the next presentation. Thanks, everybody. Hi, everybody. I hope you had a good conversation in your breakout rooms. We certainly did. We had some interesting conversations. what we said we would do is let a reporter just say a couple points of interesting things that came up from each of them. So I'm going to defer to the reporter, and the reporter for our room is Carol.
David, they're not all back yet.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
You might just want to wait a moment.
We will wait 1 second.
There you go, they're back now.
Here they come. There we go. Hi, everybody. I hope you had a good breakout discussion in your rooms. Hope you had an interesting conversation. I'm not going to say anything more. We did say we'd have a reporter just say maybe a point or two about what came up in the various ones. So let's go to the first group. I think we had 4 rooms, or were there 3 or 4? I noticed there was 1 empty room. We had 3 rooms. Okay, great. So let's go with the first room, and that was Carol as the reporter. What did we talk about, Carol?
Hi, David. Thank you. You know, we had some really interesting collections in the room with lots of great geographical dimensions. On the one hand, we had a collection of materials from a Brazilian federation for women gaining the right to vote that was connected probably with other international organizations. We also had the records of I think it's East Indian Trading Company, so the movement of spices, particularly during the 17th century. And then finally, we had the archives of UNESCO that was another one that obviously was predicated on sort of geographical information, and was in fact presented a problem of a different kind, and that is, how do you select among so many items that have geographical dimensions? How do you select a collection that is most suitable for this kind of processing? So that was our group.
Thank you, Carol. What about the second group? Who's our reporter from the second group?
I think it was, I don't remember my group number, sorry.
Okay. Hi, Oscar.
Hi. So in our group, we had a lot of great ideas. Oh, hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm from New York City. So we had 2 main ideas. And one of the first ones was to like digitize the digitization of documents, photos, and other artifacts in New York City. And relating to like first generation immigrants, right? So like my parents talk always about the first photos that they took in New York City when they first got to New York City. So I think it will be really cool to like share those photos and place them in the map. And yeah, and then like maybe like important documents, like or like letters, you know, that have like sentimental value. And then another one, super interesting, I think, was the mapping of photos, documents, or artifacts to Southern African borders, right? So specifically, there's always like land dispute, border disputes. So it will be really interesting to map like those specific borders before they were borders and then after they became borders. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. What about our third group? Who's I don't know if the number is right anymore, but who is the next reporter who wants to talk about their group?
So go ahead. I don't know if we were group 3 or not, but we had a really interesting conversation with Oku about the work that she's doing in the Quartz Foundation in Indonesia to digitize 33 kilometers of archival material. She's has digitized 2, I believe it was 2 kilometers, so there's some work ahead. And then we also spoke about the challenges around making handwritten text machine readable for analysis. And then we also had an interesting conversation with Turkey, who is with the Saudi Broadcast Authority, and the thousands of hours of audio and video that their group is digitizing and attaching metadata to, and how that allows them to sort of trace the cultural heritage of musical genres as it moves around the kingdom.
Oh, that sounds like a great chat. There's incidentally, Turkey, there's a lot of really interesting sound maps and audio-visual maps that exist nowadays, where you can actually use that geographic representation as a way of those are, when you have a map like that, it's very exploratory, like it allows people to go to the places they want to. But if you think about the $1 billion code, the whole reason that people wanted something like Google Maps is because everybody wanted to go home to see something about them, about their own home place, right? So it's a wonderful way of connecting with people in different places. Great. So I think that brings us to the end. We're a couple minutes over. So what I suggest that we do is not take a full 10-minute break, but we take about a 5-minute break just so we can stretch our feet, have a little cup of coffee or some water, something like that. So let's say it's now exactly at the hour. Let's say that we come back at 5 minutes past the hour, and we'll start with our second presentation at that point. See you real soon, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Give everyone just a couple minutes to come back to their screens from our quick break. Hope everybody had a relaxing break. The next presentation, the second of our sessions of 4 sessions, is going to be led by Estelle Gueville from the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Colleague from just a couple of kilometers up the road. Her presentation is called Research Image Data Management Using Tropy. I'll tell you a little bit about Estelle. Estelle Gueville is assistant researcher at the Louvre Abu Dhabi. She graduated from Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne University and developed her professional expertise in several institutions in France and in the Gulf. She's a medievalist, and she's interested in applying digital methods and comparative approaches to the study of manuscripts. I'm going to pass over to Estelle.
Thank you, David, for the introduction. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let me know if you can see it. I guess it's good. Perfect. Okay. So yes, today we'll talk about Tropy, which is a software for image management and visualization. So I guess like we can start with a few questions like, do you ever have hundreds of images to organize and manage for a project and felt a bit overwhelmed by the abundance of it? So this software might help you a little bit. So, okay. Yeah, so our goals today will be to introduce you to Tropy and to introduce the basic features of the software applied to a specific project. And in the end, in breakout rooms, we might want to brainstorm potential integration of Tropy into your own practice. So how this presentation will go, I will first introduce quickly what is Tropy, the uses and purposes, and just explain quickly the essential vocabulary particular to that software. Then I will show you using the software how you can really use it. And then we'll move on to some discussions. So what is Tropy? So Tropy is an independent open source project tailor-made for researchers. It was created by the organizations behind Zotero, Omeka, and Sorcery. I don't know if you know them or not, but we can talk about it after. Another interesting thing about Tropy is that it is an open access software, which is accessible on their GitHub. So it's really, really nice. Tropy was created with archival work and research in mind, but can really be used for any kind of research involving a consequent number of images. It is not an archive management system, but it gives you the opportunity to collect images in one place, describe them, organize them, and visualize them, and then to export the metadata that are associated for further analysis. So it's quite easy to use, intuitive, and it gives you the possibility to make notes on the pictures themselves, for example. It works very well for individual researchers. However, because it is an application that runs locally on your computer, it is hard to use with a larger team, but we'll see at the end of the presentation how to get around this. So the essential vocabulary. So just a few words for you to understand how that works. So we have the project first. It's a general project that should include every part of your research, like for example, a thesis or research project or anything you want to work on. Then in the software, you have some lists, which are different elements of your research and ways to organize your images. You also have a possibility to use tags and create your own useful categories to organize your pictures the way you want. You can also search, so you have a search bar, and you can search by basically every element that you have in Tropy. And then you have metadata, photo, item, object, and notes. So we'll go through that a little bit more in detail now. So I'm gonna open the software, if that works. Yes. So for example, we will start by creating a project. So let's call that WIDH ICA, for example. So this is our new project here. So this is how the software looks like. So you can import then your pictures. So for example, I have a set of pictures that are here, of images that I want to import. The easiest way is just to drag and drop inside Tropy. And then you will have your picture just appearing on the software. So it's quite easy to use. You have other possibilities like opening here and importing the pictures or even a folder. That works really well. You can also open several projects at the same time by clicking on open in new window. Then the question of photo to item that we just talked about. So here you have what we call an item, and an item can be a single picture as you have here, or a couple of images that you group together. So for example, I want to use those two and I can just create an item made of several pictures that you have here. So what is the purpose of the item? It basically allows you to group your pictures together. So for example, it can be like details of, for example, a letter or same artwork or archive that you want to group together. In that case here, it's not, it's a bit different, but it works. Then you have the possibility of tagging. So what is the purpose of the different tags? So as you can see here, we haven't created any tags yet, but we will come to that very soon. So the purpose of the tags is basically to delineate subjects, organization, to highlight some content and many other things that you might want to do. So my advice is really to think carefully beforehand about what your research questions are and create your list of tags accordingly. So you can just create tags really easily by right-clicking and then new tag, and then you can just like put any kind of description. So for example, here we might want to segregate between inside architecture and outside architecture. So we can just put inside, for example. And then it's quite easy to tag an item. You can just click here, and on the tag system, you can add the tag to it. You can also add the tag to several items at the same time, and you can just do exactly the same here. So here you see our first line, they all have the tagging system and they're all tagged as inside, which is obviously not the case for those two. So you have to be mindful during the creation of new tags because Tropy is case sensitive. So you can inadvertently create twice the same tag with upper and lower case, for example. So be really careful when you create them. Then you can also assign some color to your tags. So you can choose yourself, or you can just apply automatically some random color when you create them, which can be useful for you visually to remember what you've done and where. So currently there is no way to export and import a list of tags. However, you can put all the tags on one image, for example, and just copy paste this image from one project to another. It will then create all the tags in the new project. So that's a good way to work around this limitation of the software at the moment. So then we have the list. So this is another very useful feature of Tropy. And it's quite easy. Once again, you can just create a new list. And then you can, for example, create the first section of a paper or chapter 1, for example. And then you can create another one which will gather all the images for your chapter 2. You can also create like sub lists that will just go inside subsection 1. So it's quite easy to organize your pictures. You can then just select the images that you want to use and just drag and drop in the list. So all the images stay in that general overview, but then you can go inside the list and then you have just what you have moved here. So items can appear in multiple lists. You can put them in as many lists as you want, and you can use as many tags as you want. So it's useful to create structured organization, but also unstructured thematic organization or specific details of interest to you. Yes, that's it. So if we move on to one image in particular, that's quite interesting because you can really zoom in your pictures, so you can have a look at it. You can modify a little bit and you can add any notes you want here, either description or whatever you need. I mean, in case of other kind of documents, you can add transcriptions, for example. You can add really whatever you want. If we come back to that view here, so let's go back in the general view. So you have also, of course, the metadata. So metadata can be as freeform as you want, but it's generally best to try to record metadata using a standard that already exists. So why would you do that? The standards provide consistency both within your own project and also in the larger community of scholarship about your sources. So each category in a Tropy metadata template must be linked to a category or property from an existing metadata standard. I will explain that just after. So at present, you can only use each property once in a template, and I will show you the templates just after. So several standards or vocabularies are included in Tropy, but you can also add your own vocabulary, such as, for example, the Getty vocabulary, if that might be useful to you. A template in Tropy provides a means of creating structured metadata about your sources. So each item in a Tropy project can have its own unique template, though you'll probably find that only 1 or 2 templates or templates for each collection from which you have sources will meet your needs. So 3 templates ship with Tropy, and they are designed to capture the information most commonly useful to researchers. So this is what you have here: the Dublin core, the Tropy correspondence, and the Tropy generic. But you might want to create your own template. For example, if you want to add some coordinates, if you want to map then your images. So this is what we have here. I've created my own template with the longitude, the latitude, and the location, which is shown on the image. So how do you create your own templates? You go to Preferences, and then in Template, you can just basically choose and create one. So this is the one I created for the purpose of that exercise here. And then you can just add as many properties as you want. So in our case here, I've created the property title, the property longitude, the property latitude, and the location shown. I can add more if I want and just select whatever I want from the list and choose its name, the data type, and any other information. And also if I want to make that field mandatory or not. If the field is mandatory, as you can see here, we have this small exclamation point that will tell you that you have to fill in the information here. So then you can add the metadata yourself by hand, but you can also import metadata from a JSON file. So in that case here, I will just drag and drop. And yeah, that's a workaround because in my JSON file, I have the link, but so here you see I have the longitude, latitude, and location shown. that was automatically imported. I will just go back to the next, yeah. So descriptive metadata will allow you to quickly and easily locate your sources at the item level. Therefore, each item should have its own unique metadata entry, but images from the same source will often share information like collection, name, and location. So yes, also something interesting is that all the information, all the metadata that are on the image itself will be automatically imported. So whatever you already have on the on the picture will go into Tropy. Yes. So for me, there are three main things to remember when writing good metadata in Tropy. First, be as descriptive as possible, be consistent, and pay attention to the purpose of each category and field. That works, okay. So you can also install vocabularies, as I mentioned before. So here you have all the list of vocabularies that are already in Tropy, but by clicking on this part here, you can just import new ones, such as the Getty vocabulary that I have here, and it will just, oh, okay, because I already had it in it, so it didn't work. But so this is basically the one that we have here, Getty ontology. So it's quite easy to work with, and you can do a lot of things. Then we have the questions of exporting whatever you need from Tropy. So the main exporting solution is to export as a JSON. So that's what you have here. So you can select one or several information, and you can just choose to export quite easily. Sorry, so if I select two of them, for example, and I choose to export as a JSON, it will just open a new thing, and you can just paste JSON, and that should work. And you can just save it, and you will have all the metadata and all the things that you've created in Tropy exported into a JSON format. I know that JSON is not always the most useful for people who are not familiar to that language and to digital humanities in general. So they have also included a CSV plugin that you can install as well. So I have already installed it, but basically, yes, if I uninstall it, okay, just disable. So if you enable it, you can just choose then the name that you want to call it. So for example, WIDH. And you can choose if you want to include tags, include photos, include notes, print the CSV header line and everything. And you can choose the template on which it is based. So then when you export as a CSV, the pictures, you can just, the same way as we did for the JSON. Okay. I think my computer is, okay, sorry, export, please. That's the beauty of live. Okay, I don't know why it doesn't work, but usually it should work here. Sorry for that. Okay, I think my laptop has an issue, but that's the way it works, and I can have a look later at that. Finally, you can also print as a PDF, and it will export once again all the information and all the metadata that you have about your images. So test PDF, for example, and then you will find it here. And if you open it, it will give you this kind of, okay, that's really like, I'm sorry for that. It worked before, but. Okay, let's try again. Yes, okay. So it will export as a PDF like this. So you will have the picture, and then you will have both the metadata of the item and of the picture with all the information that you wanted from the template you created before. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, it's really hard to use Tropy in a team because there are no accounts in Tropy. It is not an archive management system, as I explained, and it runs locally on your laptop, which means that each person has an individual Tropy file on their computer. You can create project files consisting of a database file and your photos, and Tropy saves all the information to this database file. And you can move or access the project file from multiple devices. For example, by putting it in a folder shared, for example, on Google Drive or on GitHub. However, you need to be really careful not to work on the project at the same time with another person, because this way you might create like synchronization conflicts or override the work that someone else did. That is to say, it is possible to work on the same project file from multiple devices, but you need to be careful and know exactly what you are doing. Another strategy to make this easier might be to create multiple project files, one each for different parts of the project. So for example, you might want to work on the chapter 1 and someone else on the chapter 2, for example, of a project, or you can create other ways to separate the tasks between you and your team members. You can then copy and paste items between projects, as I mentioned earlier. So you could have individual team members work on separate sections of the project and later merge the work together into one main project file. So yes, that was very basic introduction to that software. What I suggest maybe now is to break out into different rooms and try to think maybe of collections that you might have in your institutions or personal projects for which Tropy would be useful. Maybe ask yourself, would you and how would you use Tropy in organizations and workflow? Or why would you want to use Tropy and what would be the limitations? Or you can also want to explore 2 collections that I've made available on the Google Drive. I will send the link in the drive, and then maybe see what are the questions you would have about them and how you would use Tropy to organize and visualize them, what kind of lists or tags you would want to use. And as we did with David, maybe choose a reporter to tell the group some brief comments about the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Estelle. I think we'll move now out into breakout rooms. And we'll do just as we did before.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back.
Hi.
So we had a very interesting conversation in our group. I don't know if Defi, you want to start maybe, and then we'll move on to the other groups.
Yes, of course. Basically, we had an initial conversation from a possible use case that I thought was relevant for basically all of us, but also for researchers that we help, because a lot of us do research as well, of course. I proposed that we could use Tropy to organize our photographs of presentation slides, which I believe a lot of us might have back from the olden days when we used to go to actual conferences and not get everything on Google Drive. Of course, that's also great. But I do have a lot of conference photos from like slides, and I find it hard to organize them sometimes, or to even know, or like I even forget. So I imagine this could be really useful to organize these resources. And it could also be used. It could be used as a tool generally by researchers as part of proposed sources for research data management. So this is what we talked a little bit about. And also about the possibilities of using it in a group, because I mentioned that in the organization I work for, the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam, we work with all kinds of communities that are not necessarily researchers, and it might be a good tool for them to manage photos, but with the caveat that it could rewrite one another's changes, because it's not at the moment meant as a tool to collaborate with. It's really meant to be used by an individual researcher. But definitely, I guess there could be workarounds for that. It still looks like a very usable, user-friendly tool to use, and everything stored locally, which I think is really important for security reasons when you work with sensitive materials. So this is more or less what we talked about.
Thank you, Defi. I don't know from other groups who wants to report on their discussions. Carol?
So I know, Estelle, I was in your group for a moment and then jumped into another group as well. But we spoke about, how you make the decisions, especially when you're collaborating with people who might, work in another part of the world or with a different type of organization, and how you determine which controlled vocabulary metadata schema you're going to use moving forward. And that sort of dovetailed into the other discussion that I jumped into in the other room about just the importance of making those decisions early on to ensure, access to the collections down the road for future researchers as well.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any other question or remark?
In our group, we actually had a similar conversation about whether ICA's norms for describing things were actually supported by Tropy. And the conversation, we talked a little bit about how different communities in the world can actually create templates that can be brought into Tropy. That was the first thing we talked about. But then we actually took up your invitation, Estelle, to dive into the movie photos. So we were looking at all these movie pictures, and we were trying to imagine if we had a collection like this, how would we think about it? And so we looked at the CSV file, the structured data file that was associated, that came with that collection, and we noticed that there were things like genre, there were as a timeline, there were lots of different pieces already of metadata that could be used. And we were speaking a little bit about how seems nice about Tropy is that you don't necessarily have to put anything in any particular order, but when you have the metadata there, you can see it in lots of different ways, right? You can continually change the way that you visualize those items.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's the same with Tropy. It's very, it can be used in many different ways, and yeah. So I guess we've already passed the timing, so maybe we can take a short break before the next presentation.
Right, I think we were supposed to come back in about 2 minutes. So let's say that it's 43 past the hour. Would it be okay if we come back at 50 past the hour? That gives people just a little bit more than 5 minutes. So we'll come back at 50 minutes past the hour for our third presentation on handwritten text recognition. Enjoy your break.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll go ahead with session number 3, and I'd like to introduce our next presenter. We have Soufan Kermizialtin, and Soufan is a visiting assistant professor of Middle Eastern history at NYU Abu Dhabi. Her research interests center around the intersection of gender and modernization in the Middle East within the specific context of the Ottoman Modernization Project. Her current research involves deep learning methods for the automated transcription and analysis of historical archives, as well as crowdsourced transcription of Ottoman Turkish print media. And I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Beth. Let me move a few things around my screen and let's see if I can make this work. Well, hopefully you are now seeing my presentation screen, my slides. Is that right? Yes. Okay, excellent. Let's move this bar top up here as well. All right. I am unmuted and my camera is on. I think I'm good to go. All right. Hi again, everyone. Thank you very much, Beth, for the introduction, and thank you, the ICA team, for making this event possible. I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this workshop and to present to such an exciting audience. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of the pathways to creating searchable, computer actionable corpora or text collections from already digitized historical texts. And more specifically, I am going to be talking about handwritten text recognition, or HTR, for generating automated transcriptions from archival documents with the goal of creating high quality computer readable corpus at scale for historical archival collections. Before going into the details of how to do that, I first would like to clarify the terminology that I already used so far a little bit. And then I'm going to say a few words about why we are interested in converting historical texts into machine readable corpus in the first place. So terminology first. In the course of my talk, you are going to hear me use the words computer actionable, computer readable, computable, or machine readable interchangeably. For the purposes of my presentation today, they all refer to text that is in a format that a computer can read and process. As for why we are interested in rendering historical collections computable or computer readable in the first place, let me give you some context. I suspect that an audience of archivists and librarians needs no convincing at all of the advantages of digitizing their collections. In the age of the internet and ubiquitous smart devices, digitization has already become one of the main paths, if not the main path, for preserving cultural heritage and for making it available to wider audiences. From the perspective of researchers and users of these digital collections, on the other hand, the biggest promise of digitization is easier access to collections. And when I say easier access, I don't exclusively mean remote online access without needing to travel to the location of the physical collection itself. Although I can speak from personal experience that remote access is a game changer for researchers who are on a limited budget and on a tight schedule. But from the users or researchers' perspective, there are other dimensions of accessibility that are just as important as the online availability of the images of the documents. The first one is the ability to search in the digitized collections catalogs, which of course presupposes the existence of robust metadata or document summaries that are also already available online. And the other consideration, again, from the perspective of researchers in terms of access to collections, is the ability to perform keyword search in the corpus or in the text collections itself. And to take the question of accessibility one step further, scholars or researchers who utilize digital humanities tools and methods in their work always appreciate computer readable corpora because those text collections are amenable and already open to higher order analysis, like the kinds of which David, for example, has spoken about. And these computer readable corpora can be studied and visualized with corpus analytics and data visualization tools. And this is exactly where HTR, the tool that I would like to introduce today, comes into play at this particular juncture of archives, accessibility, and textual digital humanities. And very much like OCR, about which I'm going to speak very briefly in a minute, HTR is a text recognition tool, but it is developed specifically for handwritten texts and for historical archives. Here, let me take a step back and say a few words about OCR first. I'm sure many of the participants today are already familiar with OCR, or optical character recognition, which is a computer vision technology that converts images to text files, or to be more precise, OCR extracts text from images and creates text documents that the computers then can read and process. OCR algorithms are integrated into some of the most commonly used text readers today, and they are also widely available for many smart apps, smart devices on the App Store. And OCR tends to perform, most commonly available OCR platforms tend to perform relatively well for printed texts. So for example, if you take photos of the pages of a book that was, let's say, published in the 1980s in English language, chances are that the OCR in Adobe Pro, for example, that it will be able to convert those images into searchable and computer readable files with probably very high rates of accuracy. And when it comes to handwritten documents and historical documents, on the other hand, most commonly used commercial OCR engines are not always of great help for that purpose. And let me explain why. Any machine learning approach, including automated text recognition with OCR and HTR, they require the creation of training data for the neural network. And the challenge for scholars who would like to use OCR for historical texts or historical archives is that many of the OCR tools that are available to us today are trained primarily with printed Latin script texts, English language texts, or texts that are scraped from the internet and thus rely on modern web content. As a result of this, commercially available OCR tends to yield a high error rates when it is applied to handwritten text and historical collections in general, even when these collections are in English language. Moreover, for many non-Western languages that are not written in Latin script, even when we assume the existence of digital corpora in those languages, which is of course not always a given, but even when these languages do have digital corpora available, OCR tends to work for them with very high error rates, if at all. It is here that HTR comes into the picture, as it does offer a promising pathway to computable corpora creation for both printed and handwritten historical documents, and for document collections that are in cursive and connected scripts such as Arabic. And rendering these kind of collections computer readable with HTR, on the other hand, allows us to, first of all, introduce searchability to these archives, and secondly, to improve discoverability in and across these collections. And last but not the least, to convert these archival collections into data for higher order text analysis. And before explaining how we use HTR in our research, I would like to pause here very briefly for a second, maybe, to see if there are any questions so far. I know this is a lot to take in a very quick and short presentation. Are there any questions so far that needs to be addressed urgently? Otherwise, I'll go on. Okay, I the chat box is here. I assume there are no urgent questions, so I'll go ahead with the presentation. All right then, so let's turn our attention to HDR more specifically. HDR is like OCR. It is an AI-powered computer vision technology that learns to read, or more precisely, it learns to recognize handwritten texts. And in principle, an HDR engine is language agnostic, and it can be taught to recognize any writing style from any language. To start the process of training an HDR engine, we first need to provide the system with training data that will teach the neural network the specific patterns in a given body of text. In other words, in order to produce a reliable transcription model for the entirety of our corpus, we need to create an accurate ground truth or literal and exact transcription of a body of sample text that is representative of the corpus that we would like to be able to automatically transcribe. The amount or the size of the training data that is required to create a reasonably well-working HDR model really depends on the corpus that you work with. In our experiments with HDR so far, we found that approximately 40,000 words is a good starting point. But if you are working with a particularly difficult handwriting style or styles, or if this is a corpus that spans over a large time period and includes many different handwriting styles or typefaces, or if it is a text collection with a particularly challenging page layout, then you'll probably need something around 100,000 words to be able to generate an HDR model that will operate within acceptable error rates. I want to highlight here that creating the ground truth, or in other words, manually producing this rather sizable amount of transcription, does require a good amount of initial work. But I still favor HDR for its practicality, for its long-term time efficiency, and most importantly, for its scalability. And what I mean by scalability is that HDR is really most effective with large corpora, with large text collections. And once you make that initial investment of time for creating the ground truth, then you can automatically transcribe hundreds of pages within a matter of hours. The system is also flexible and accepts changes in parameters, which means with a large enough training data, it is possible to generate general HDR models that will work across wider spans of text collections that are or that were produced with different handwriting styles or typefaces. So in our work, we use the HDR platform Transcribus. And I am not going to go into the details of how to use the platform, but I added the link here on the slide. And I invite everyone, when they have a moment to do so after the workshop, have a look at their website and see what they have to offer. Transcribus is a comprehensive platform that includes tools for not only text recognition, but also for the layout analysis of the documents, for structure recognition, custom tagging of the text, as well as for keyword searching of the transcription output. And a practical aspect of Transcribus, which I really appreciate as a historian, is that it does not assume any familiarity with coding or computing. It does not expect any computing skills from the users. It offers a user-friendly standalone app as well as a web-based light version, which is really helpful if you are working on collaborative projects. I am going to admit that it does take some time getting used to the platform and figuring out all the functionality available that they have to offer. But as I said, this is a comprehensive platform and includes advanced tools for every single step of the text recognition process. And personally, what I most like about Transcribus is that it allows the repurposing or recycling of both the HTR models and their training data, so that you can retrain the neural network for other corpora, but also you can share your training data and HTR models with the community, which does save a lot of time and researcher power, especially if you are working on a large-scale project. Okay, so here I would like to show you some of the materials that for which we have implemented HTR training so far. For our very first project with Transcribus, we have started using or utilizing the platform. That is the project on the right-hand side of the image. We use the platform to make headways into automating the transcription of Arabic script Ottoman Turkish newspapers that had been published after the middle of the 19th century. We are transcribing or transliterating them to Latin script modern Turkish, and Transcribus HTR seems to work very well even when we move between scripts and alphabets. And the other project in which we are utilizing, oh, hold on, there is actually one more thing that I wanted to add about our Ottoman Turkish project. We have first started working on 2 different publications, and we just wanted to get a sense of if HTR is going to work for this particular collection at all. And the error rates we have ended up with were in both cases around 5%, which is, in my opinion, a very encouraging result. Currently, we are expanding our training set to include other publications in our grant route. And the latest general model that we created, which is based on approximately 60,000 words from 6 different newspapers, it works with an error rate of approximately 8%. And the other collection that we are working on with HTR is the of which you can see the image on the left-hand side of the slide. This is the collection of handwritten letter books of the Office of the British Political Residency in the Persian Gulf. And these letters are part of the India office records and have already been digitized and made available online by the Qatar Digital Library. And for the Bashir collection, we have used the HTR platform to begin to construct hand-specific transcription models that are specialized for individual volumes, as well as generalized models that are capable of transcribing letters and volumes across a wider span of this particular corpus. And so far, the results are encouraging. For example, our latest general model, which was created based on approximately 100,000 words from 5 different volumes and includes at least 8 different handwriting styles, that model is working at an error rate of 4.87%. which is again an encouraging outcome for this kind of work. So our intention with these 2 projects is to be able to convert a good size, a good chunk of these collections into computable corpora and to be able to analyze them with distance reading methods and to ask the kind of questions, research questions that we are at the moment are unable to ask of these collections because they are not yet converted into computer readable format. We are, how are we doing in terms of timing? I think I'm at about 15 minutes. Or, no?
Yeah, Sufan, you have 15 minutes, exactly.
Okay, all right then. At this point, I would like to invite the participants to have a look at 2 specific HTR case studies or 2 specific archives that utilized HTR in Transcribus for portions of their collections. They are very different in nature. The New Zealand Alpine Journal is this project involves the digitization of the entire collection, entire range of publication of the Alpine Journal, and they do when you go into the breakout rooms, you'll have a chance to see it for yourself, but they are interfaced, their website is interfaced with Transcribus, and they provide full text searchability, but also full text transcription of the journal collection. The other archive that I am going to invite you to have a look at is the Beyond 2020 project. And it's a very super interesting and exciting project. And what they are trying to do is to virtually reconstruct the building as well as the entire records collections of the Public Record Office of Ireland, which was destroyed in a fire in 1922. So on their website, they both reconstruct the building, but also the collections. And they have also transcribed a good chunk of their collections with transcripts. And some part of the collection is open to keyword search only. Other parts are available for full text transcription. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to put in the chat the links for these two. For these two collections, so that we can all go and have a closer look at them.
David's already done it.
Oh, it is okay. Thank you very much, David. Okay, then let me add these to chat. I came up with a number of questions or things that we can keep in mind when we are having a look at these collections. I mean, these are of course only suggestions. I recommend you all to first have a look at the about page of each archive, and they have done a very nice job of explaining what it is that they want to achieve with the digitization projects. And then it is also a good idea, it might be a good idea to pay attention to what kind of searchability and access options they offer for their users. And I would be especially curious to hear from the participants today if they think, after having a look at these two particular collections and how they use the HTR, I would be very curious to hear if there are any document collections or portions of collections in their holdings that they feel like might be good candidates for this kind of digitization / HTRizing project. I think we are going to have 4 breakout rooms. So I suggest the breakout rooms 3. Yes. Okay. So I suggest then the breakout room members can have a look at the Alpine Journal, and the other 2 group can check out the Beyond 2020 project, because that is more extensive. And then should we say 10 minutes? I think we have 10 minutes to talk about that. Yeah.
We'll call people back to the main room.
Okay.
Automatically, yeah.
All right, and then have it wrap up. All right, sounds good. See you all in the breakout rooms then.
Thanks, Yvonne. Couple seconds. Let people come back to the screens for our last session, session 4, called Images as Data. And our presenter for session 4 is Carol Kyoto. Carol is the librarian for collections and digital scholarship for the Americas, Europe, and Oceania division at Harvard University Library in the United States. She has her PhD from Yale University with a dissertation on technology in Dante's Divine Comedy. Prior to joining Harvard, she pursued postdoctoral research at the Yale Digital Humanities Lab. Her teaching focuses on the reciprocal relationship between data and the humanities, a topic she has taught at the European Summer University at the University of Leipzig, which we saw on the screen, one of the DH schools in the world, and at the Winter Institute in Digital Humanities at NYU Abu Dhabi. We're so happy to have Carol with us. Her research interests include data in the humanities, Italian literature, the history of publishing, and scholarly communication and digital humanities. Carol is the principal investigator on the grant Images as Data and joins the second cohort of Collections as Data, part to whole initiative funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. I'm going to pass it over to Carol.
Thanks, David. Hi, everybody. It's really lovely to be here today, and I've really enjoyed a lot of the conversations that we've had so far. I am going to share my screen here. And okay, can you all see my screen? Excellent. All right. So today I'm going to be talking to you about images as data and the project that we did, which actually examined the processing, exploration, and discovery at scale. As David mentioned, I'm the librarian for collections and digital scholarship at Harvard University Library. What does that mean? That means that I collect with an eye. I work in collection development, and I collect with an eye towards collections that are amenable to digital scholarship. And I also encourage the use of our collections in various digital scholarship initiatives, not just on campus, but also off. So today I'm going to be talking, initially we'll look at an introduction to the Images as Data initiative at Harvard Library. I'll explain a little bit what I mean by collections and images as data. Then we're going to be talking a little bit about something called distant viewing. I'll unpack that a little bit. I'm grateful for Supan actually, because she's given us some outlines already about what makes a collection computationally actionable. So thank you, Supan, for getting us started with that. And then I also am going to be looking at, finally, a really important question, and one that I'm increasingly dealing with, and that is, how does algorithmic processing change how we understand our collections? And there are a lot of, David alluded to this at the beginning with the introduction, there are a lot of different ethical and professional commitments that we have in the libraries and archives towards our collections. And algorithmic processing really introduces a new wrinkle into that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So I thought I'd start by giving you an overview of the libraries and archives at Harvard so that you could understand the motivation that was coming behind this Images as Data initiative. We have over 6 million digitized items. And when you start looking at some of these numbers and knowing that particularly for the digitization, now that our imaging services people are back on site and continuing to digitize, that number is growing every day. But this gives you kind of an idea of the scale of the collections that we're dealing with, and therefore really something that's crying out for some really significant solutions. As you might imagine, this isn't something that can be tackled one person at a time. So our motivation with this initiative, it wasn't a real ambitious one, in the sense that in spite of having all of these collections, what we realized was we really didn't have sort of the know-how on site to deal with this in a meaningful way. We wanted to engage our librarians and archivists and think a little bit more about the impact of data science, machine learning, and artificial intelligence on library workflows. So that was kind of the first thing, was we really had sort of an educational and professional development aim in mind. The second one, again, very important, was thinking about, what are best practices in this area? What is this going to look like for Harvard Library? And can we make recommendations for an ethical decision-making framework? And then finally, this is the more practical side, was thinking about, okay, well, if our current workflows are this, what is it going to take if we want to integrate some kind of algorithmic processing into this, and think about how we might implement it? So that's kind of giving you just an overview of the why behind this project. There we go. So we became, we were involved in, we applied for a collections as data grant, and we are part of a 12-team cohort that was funded by the Mellon Foundation. And this just kind of gives you an idea of sort of the aims of this. We are the second batch, second generation of cohorts. We just had a summative forum the other day, and we're just kind of looking at these various points in sort of thinking about collections as data in libraries. There's a timeline to this that as I would say started actually back probably in the early 2000s. And we're increasingly seeing collections as data initiatives across the globe. To do this, we established a partnership with the Distant Viewing Lab at the University of Richmond. And the two co-directors of that lab were responsible for Photogrammer, which was a project that came up earlier in one of the presentations, but they had also developed something that is called the Distant Viewing Toolkit. And we were really interested in working with them, partnering with them to think more about how we might use this distant viewing framework, that is algorithmic processing of library collections, to examine our own. I'm going to pause a moment and say that there are actually many commercial frameworks that are available. However, these algorithms a lot of these commercial algorithms are trained on materials that are freely available on the web, or training sets that have proved to be very problematic. So we were very keen to be partnering with a group that had a strong sort of critical humanities background, and that would be able to have that inform their work across the board. So the Images as Data initiative was started out of the result of a Born Digital collecting pilot, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. And as I mentioned before, these were the various goals that we had for this particular initiative. Supan mentioned earlier, what does it take to make something computationally actionable? One of the first things that I think that we need to think about is, from the moment that we digitize materials, we end up with a whole host of file formats, right? And those file formats can allow us to do different things. These files have different affordances than the media from which they spring. And therefore, we really need to think about sort of when we move from tangible media or tangible assets through the process of digitization into these file formats, we need to take a really close look at, first, what can we do, but second, how we do it and why we do it, whether it's a good idea to be doing it. So these are kind of some of the questions that are underlying questions that are informing the work that we're doing. To go back, I said that this came out of a Born Digital collection development initiative. I work in the Americas, Europe, and Oceania division that David mentioned earlier, which sounds like something out of a James Bond movie where there's some evil person sitting in a basement. But it is in fact based on collecting imprints. So when we think about collection development at Harvard, we divide our collection development efforts by the country of imprint. So when we talk about the AEOD, or the Americas, Europe, and Oceania division, that means that we're collecting in the materials that are printed in those areas. And when I first came to Harvard about 3 years ago, we started looking at, we had a well-established project that was the Charlie Archive, that was based on the terrorist attacks on the Charlie Hebdo headquarters in Paris. And we were thinking about different types of initiatives that we might take. That was a sort of a participatory, a community-sourced archive, but we were thinking increasingly about how we might supplement the extensive political ephemera collections, print ephemera collections, particularly regarding political material, with born digital items. So you see a couple of samples here, the Independence March in Poland collection. You also see the video appeals to the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. That was an initiative that we spearheaded with the Ivy Plus Federation. So we have sort of a pretty, I would say, well-established workflow for these types of collections. So we began this. I'm going to give you one example of the collection that was used in the Images as Data initiative, and that is the Yellow Vest. We did a web archiving project that was based on the Yellow Vest movement. It began as a web archiving project. This kind of gives you an idea of some of the materials that we had collected with this web archiving project. But increasingly, we realized that there was a whole series of materials that we were overlooking, or that weren't part of the collection that we really wanted to sort of collect and think about. And we began an extensive program of born digital outreach. So we were contacting photographers and activists and collecting their materials. One thing that I will mention that I think was particularly an eye-opener for us was, in fact, when you start dipping your toe into these types of collection development initiatives, the scale, again, really comes home. So we were starting to see that there were a lot of materials that were available to us, and that we were increasingly collecting large amounts of photographs, and that these born digital photographs were actually accompanied by XF files, for example, all kinds of different sort of I was about to say paratextual. I mean, I have to think the metadata that's associated with these materials, and we wanted to really explore some of the possibilities that were associated with this collection. So we started thinking, well, if we are going to be doing some kind of algorithmic processing for our libraries, what are some of the different outcomes that we can have? And we can think about this in a couple of different ways. On the first hand, I think, photography is a really interesting area because it cuts across all kinds of collections, right? We have sort of the documentary impulse, or something that's being used as evidence. We have also something that's being used as art. So you could find at least at Harvard, you could find photography collections in the university archives. You could find them at the art museum. You could find them in our in the collections of the AEOD. You could find them in anthropology. You could find them really cuts right across all of these different types of repositories. And therefore, some of the issues that might be relevant for people that are working in these repositories for this algorithmic processing, one of them might be metadata generation. We had one librarian in particular who had lamented the fact of cataloging all of the landscape photography is a rather tedious task, and therefore thinking about how we might automate some of this material, and think about also how we might have new types of metadata yields using algorithmic processing. Another way that we could think about this is also a collections discovery layer. This was, again, if we go back to the Photogrammer project, we can look at this and say, this is in fact what Photogrammer, that project does, is it actually is, on the one hand, someone's research activity, but it also is, in a way, a way of discovering the collections through an interface, right? Through a visualization. And then finally, algorithmic processing could be just a research activity, and therefore the library may be poised to provide some kind of service around that, whether it be a cloud-based service that's actually a really extensive sort of infrastructure, or whether it simply be, having someone like myself helping the researcher think through creating a discovery layer for their own individual project. So what you're seeing here are different also levels of participation that a library or an archive might be engaging in with respect to these collections. I put this in again. I'm not sure why, but probably just to reiterate the fact that this is something that I feel strongly about, that we need to be thinking about. So I spoke a little bit earlier about the distant viewing toolkit, and I'm going to put this up. This looks very complicated, but I think it's important to sort of unpack. I've been talking about algorithmic processing, and we look at this and think, well, what exactly is this? So what you're seeing here is a schema of the distant viewing toolkit's internal architecture, and it really gives you an idea of what is happening within the toolkit at the processing level in order for you to have some kind of outcome. Now, I'm going to actually provide you with sort of a something for you to experiment and play around with in a moment. But I want you to just think about the idea that this type of processing occurs not sort of in a vacuum, but it occurs on the collections themselves. And so I think that this is something that's really important for us to think about, is that in a way, using this toolkit, unlike, for example, the training sets that are provided, or the algorithms, commercially available algorithms, this is actually using cultural heritage to analyze cultural heritage. So what does it do? The toolkit constructs a code system. It then annotates the corpus, that is the collection that we're looking at. It then aggregates those extracted codes, and then it allows you to explore the various annotations with visualizations, right? So it allows you to count things, or it allows you to, look at a whole series of things. For example, with the Yellow Vest collection, the toolkit was very good at surfacing all of the yellow vests and all of the writing that was on the yellow vests. And then thinking about sort of the types of different things that we can communicate, the ways that we can communicate those results through public projects and workshops like these. So I have here a bit.ly that I would suggest that if you'd like to go to, can you still see my screen if I go to this?
We lost the bit.ly.
Okay, you lost the, I'll put the, sorry. There's the bit.ly.
I got it in the chat.
Okay, so what I'd like you to do is now, before there are some rules of the road here. This is a Google Collab Notebook. Before you use this, you need to make a copy of this for yourself. So you'll click File, and you will go down and you can save a copy. And that is going to be the copy that you're going to be working from.
So just to make sure that we understand, we save a copy in Drive.
Yes, right? Save a copy in Drive. Okay, are we there? Okay. Now you get to, if you are, I want you to be working from your copy and drive. And the way you can see it is at the very top here, it will say copy of. Okay, that way you know that you're in the copy. All right, great. So what we're looking at here is the Collab Notebook, which could also be, runs off of Python code. And in the slides that I will make available to you, you will also have access to that Python, that Jupyter notebook that if anybody is interested in pursuing this further can use. So how this works is that with these, I don't know if anybody's used these Collab before, is that what you see in the gray is what you see in the gray is the code. And this particular little piece runs the code, right? This little play button. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to rerun this just to be sure. And for those of you who are unaccustomed to working in programming, just a reminder, this was something that I really needed to do myself, was that you need to be working sequentially. So that means that if you do 1, you do 2, you do 3. Okay. So it's not, we don't want to go out of order here. And that's part of the reason you see this all numbered. And each time you click these buttons, you'll see that it executes the code. So the next one we're going to is download data, and we're going to run this cell.
So Carol, here's a simple question. How do we know that a cell is done?
You see this little check mark, this little green check mark to the left? And if you hover over it, it says executed. It also gives you the time. So now I'm going to move down and I'm going to run this. I'm going to load the modules. That was a quickie. And I encourage you to explore this afterwards too, because I have just something. All right, here, I'm just going to go ahead and rerun it. But what we're doing here is we're grabbing an image from the corpus and we're displaying it. Okay. And you'll see in the notes, this will explain a little bit how these images are data. That is how the computer is looking at these images. And in fact, we see that the computer is looking at this in terms of its pixels, in terms of numbers, right? If we look here, we can see again, we'll get an array that gives us sort of the first rows and columns of the image. So this is a really, before I gave you that illustration of the sort of the books with digitization turning into file formats, this actually dives in a little deeper, gets a little more granular, and doesn't think about the file format, but actually thinks about this at the level of pixelation. All right. So one of the things that we did in order to, for example, look at the yellow vests in a photograph of yellow vests is that we ran object segmentation. And what this does is that it turns and looks at the image and divides it up into various pieces. This is taking a little while. There we go. Oh, did I got an error. Okay. All right, let me try this again. This is what I get for doing a live demo. I could have just done I'll have to go back and have a look at it. But what happens when we start doing the object segmentation is it allows the computer to start categorizing, right? We can start categorizing these images on the basis of the different types of objects that are within them, okay? So it's starting to differentiate. So when I spoke earlier about, for example, the landscape photography, object segmentation does a differentiates, for example, between the sky and the land and the mountain and maybe a horse. So thinking about sort of mapping out these various areas. And then once you have that, then you can start to think about how this is going to work on classifying these photographs according to those segmented objects. Okay. So I'm going to go back to my slides for a moment. And forgive me, I kind of left you hanging there, but I'll have to go back and check that error in a second. But what I want to get to is when we start thinking about this. So we start thinking about we're dividing this collection up by objects. We're starting to think about this collection in terms of its visual similarity. Right. And in the case of the collection that's in the Google Collab, these are photographs from the American Photographers Association. It's a large group of photographs from American professional photographers over the space of about 50 years. And we can start to sort of divide up, right, a portrait, for example, from a landscape photograph. We can start to begin to categorize these things. And I think you can already start to think about what some of the problems might be with this. One of the reasons that we used the Yellow Vest collection, for example, as part of our part of the images as data collection was that activist photography and photography of protests create certain types of issues related to ethical issues related to these collections, right? We can start to think about what are some of the problems that are coming up, that are surfacing in this type of processing. So one of the things that we did was we've started, and I haven't shared it with you today just because it's still a work in progress, but we have started thinking about these collections sort of in terms of a decision-making framework. What are the ethical implications that we need to think about when we start thinking about processing these collections? What are the types of things? Now, some of these, for a community of archivists, this is not anything new. This is something that archivists have been, thinking about and have been really at the forefront of thinking about these types of questions. But the wrinkle here of algorithmic processing actually introduces some different kinds of amplification, for example, some difficulties in managing certain results at scale that really have their own sort of set of questions. So we started thinking a little bit about this and where we might think in the accessioning process, for example, where we might apply some kind of ethical decision-making framework. And so far what we've come up with is that, these are really need to be prioritized according to the needs of the repository. And the needs of the repository are really sort of dictated also by the collections that sit within them. The other thing is thinking about when this is going to occur, and we've really felt like it was something that could occur all the way across. We could think about a collection being digitized and or recataloged, for example, and thinking about, using this as a way of doing some work in terms of reparative cataloging, which is a pretty widespread initiative right now in North America. There are all kinds of moments when we could be thinking about these, but the idea was that we really would like to develop a framework, an ethical decision-making framework that is flexible rather than prescriptive, just because so many of these collections present their own set of particular issues. So one of the really important considerations here is that as we move from in that transition from tangible asset into through digitization or through collecting born digital items, we really need to think about this across the data life cycle. So we're no longer thinking about, these kinds of ethical questions just on the basis of a collection and the way that we're cataloging or the way that we're displaying the collection. We really need to be thinking about all of these different sorts of ideas throughout. And as you can see, this is a very complicated landscape. These are what you're looking at here are links to various frameworks that have been put out, from intersectional feminism to philosophical ethics, that look at sort of the ethical implications of data. And it's a complex environment, and it's something that I think increasingly we're going to have to wrap our heads around as we move forward in our efforts in this area. So I apologize for the glitch with the Collab, and I am going to go back. You will have that link. That link will persist. So if you're interested in working with this further, or maybe sharing with people in your collections, I would welcome it. And at this point, what I'd like to do, I know the others have done breakout rooms here, but I feel like right now I'd really like to just take a moment and answer a few questions, have a moment to look at the chat as well, because I haven't had a chance to look at that, and think about, I'd also love to hear what type of impact this could have, for example, on the collections that you all are working with. So thanks.
Thank you, Carol.
Well, I have a question. I'll get us started. I want to take over. So Carol, you spoke about, so part of your role, or a big part of your role, is thinking about which born digital collections you should acquire to allow for computational use. And so I'm just thinking about it also from somebody, a librarian, digital scholarship person. What makes collecting different between the decisions and the thoughts that you have to give around more traditional analog collection development and the decisions that you make there, whether or not to acquire something? And then when you're thinking about collections that are born digital, and what considerations, you touched on this a little bit, what considerations you have to put into those decisions as well?
Thank you. That's a really great question. I think that when we move into sort of this born digital realm in terms of collection acquisition, one of the things that I think is really important is that, stewardship comes to the fore, right? And I think that one of the my colleagues are actually probably a little tired of hearing me say this, but with tangible assets, and believe me, we have many at Harvard Library, with tangible assets, benign neglect was actually a semi-responsible solution, right? That in fact, by placing these in a, placing these things in a dry place where it's, they stay relatively undisturbed, there is not a, that you're not seeing this significantly degrade, right? I mean, acid-based paper notwithstanding, but you're not seeing really sort of this kind of degradation. Whereas born digital collecting requires active stewardship. Okay, so if we're talking about, with print materials, there's a sort of, certain element of passivity. And again, there are degrees of that, because it's certainly, there are plenty of, we have an active conservation crew, an active preservation agenda, but with the digital, this becomes a very important activity. And so I think that one of the challenges for us is to think about our capacity across the library in terms of how much can we steward and how can we steward it, and then the degrees, because again, a tangible asset, one would hope you'd be able to keep it. We talk about in perpetuity, right? And to do that with a digital asset actually becomes a very active process, right? And therefore, for us to fulfill the mandate that we have established for ourselves, we really need to think about that. So that's kind of the one of the things that really changes and determines actually, the extent to which someone might embark on this. We could also think about not that there are degrees of preservation, right? We could agree to preserve for a certain amount of time, or for a certain amount, a certain period, or in a certain format, and then from that format no further. So it's not, so it also kind of changes that formulation too, right? We could, we're not putting everything necessarily in cold storage, that there may be things that we need in different ways. So that's, oh, Margaret, thank you. That's really, I think digital preservation is really something that is, it's an important question, and it really affects the type of work that we do. And then if you add then sort of this processing layer that I'm speaking about, if we add the processing layer, then we're thinking, okay, are we going to preserve the processing layer? Are we going to preserve the visualization? Or are we just going to preserve the metadata and the documentation associated with how the metadata was derived, for example? What we really start thinking about a wider variety of outputs that are available to people. And so it is a very complex environment that we are currently working in. And so that kind of makes it exciting.
Thank you.
Oh, I just see Margaret has added, the ICA has launched a course on managing digital archives that covers digital preservation issues. Thank you, Margaret. That's wonderful to hear. I think that, this is a really important point, and understanding then the full cost for us, all of us, the full cost of stewarding these assets, because it's not just our digital preservation colleagues who get hit by a tsunami. It's also, those of us that are curating and collecting these materials need to understand, what we are capable of stewarding responsibly.
I want to ask you a question, Carol. I mean, I think one of the things that stood out to me about your presentation that I really appreciated was this idea of what happens when the algorithm is in charge of somehow dividing up the collection or making subsets of the collection, which is, of course, a task that yet, you know, once upon a time, I guess, was relegated to a human being, I think. Maybe there was something else going on, but I think that the idea was that there was an implicit ethical consideration that was sort of driving the way that we do that collections were divided up or cataloged or described or something like that.
Yeah.
And I wondered, like, can you give us an example, for example, of what you were talking about by amplification? You know, what would we not want an algorithm to do to our collections?
Well, I think one of the challenges here is that we need to understand that the expertise of catalogers, archivists, librarians cannot be supplanted, right, by algorithmic processing and discovery. So that's the first thing, that there is, and in fact, this process that we started on is thinking about this as human in the loop processing. That is, that this is something that facilitates processing for catalogers or librarians, but that it is not something that replaces it, right? So it allows us to work at scale. It allows us to process a lot more materials, but that it does not replace the work of the cataloger. Also because of the ethical questions that inform that profession, right? That now is becoming, I think, increasingly very important that we start thinking about, okay, how does someone working with an algorithm, how do they determine whether something works, you know, is working in a way that we'd like it to or not? I can think a little bit about sort of, for example, the American Professional Photographers Association has the photographs that are in that collection. We have photographs in blackface, for example. We have materials that really need to be discovered, surfaced, but that need to have the context that's related, the important context that's related to that. So when I start to think about amplification, I start to think, for example, you know, amplification of racial dynamics within the United States, without a given context to that, particularly to those items in our collection and why they are there, I think becomes a very controversial and difficult question to deal with. I think we've also, in a lot of cases, we'll see, for example, I've noticed there are some, you know, commercially available digitized collections where these materials have been removed. And I don't think that's necessarily a solution either. You know, there's been a lot of really important work recently. I'm thinking of the work of Sophia Noble, for example, that looks at sort of algorithmic processing, and this in particular using commercial algorithms, algorithmic processing as being a source of bias, oppression, and various other sort of nefarious activities. And when you start to do that, when you start to see that come out at scale, I think it becomes, you know, it becomes very challenging then to bring those questions back down to the research or instructional context within which many of us work.
Thank you. I think we are in a great place to begin transitioning towards a more general discussion, right? I think we have lots that we put out on the table. I just want to thank Estelle and Supan and Carol for their presentations. And I think what we saw was a really interesting spectrum, right, of approaches. Some approaches which are very, let's say, very researcher-centered, some which are very profession-centered, some which might, like my own and Estelle's, might be more sort of for small, and we thinking maybe on a smaller scale, and we look at Carol and Supan's presentations, we can imagine going to really, really enormous scales. I guess what we could do at this point is transition to a more general discussion and some questions. This is an opportunity for anybody to ask anything that's on their mind, maybe make a comment that connects some of the presentations together, maybe just talk about something that's going on in their own home environment, where you start to see the general issues that have come up in our workshop today, intersecting with that environment. So I'm just going to let everybody just sort of leave it open. I think we can raise our hands or unmute ourselves, turn on our camera whenever we feel like we would like to ask such a question. And I really think that we can just have from this point can be a somewhat unstructured conversation between all of us about the issues that are of concern to the participants in the workshop. And that would include also people who presented asking each other questions, if those are also issues.
Of course.
Please.
So of course I have another question. So I've been thinking about a lot about, so I think this is for the presenters or anybody in this group who's, a scholar, a researcher, and using the physical collections versus the digital version of that collection. In the breakout with Carolina, we were talking about how the policy at the Archives of Brazil is that if an item from the collection is digitized, it is then not, the physical copy is no longer available. So the digital surrogate is what is used. So I'm just wondering, from a scholarly perspective, there's so much to gain through digitization, but through your work, and it's kind of ironic asking digital humanists this, but is there anything that's lost by losing access or not having access to the primary source in the physical collection or item?
Well, I might start as someone working in museums, but also digital humanist. Of course, I have both sides of and yes, of course, when you work only with digital objects, you lose a lot of things. You lose the materiality of it. And I myself work mainly with manuscripts, and you cannot have everything with a digital object. You lose, you cannot really understand how the object was made, how it can give you some insight in some cases, but this is not enough. And I really see the digital object and the material, the materiality, the real object as complementary, like they work together, and you cannot really do, you need both to properly have an idea of the object, whatever it is. I don't know if someone else, yeah, super.
Thank you. So I can make a quick observation on that as well. I am a historian by training, and I do use many of the materials that I am now working on rendering computer readable art things that I am also using. These are materials that I'm using in my own research, particularly the Ottoman Turkish newspaper collections. And in that specific example, if especially when it comes to newspapers or historical material with that kind of complex layout, then I use access to the original material. And if I am only reading the text, let's say I search it, I digitize the collection, and I can do a keyword search, and I can get the entire, let's say, article from that particular issue. But when I use the context of that article, where it appeared on the page, on which page of the issue did that article appear, what was the title, for example, let's say, on that particular day, what was going on in the rest of the empire, that kind of contextual information can actually potentially be lost. Even the location of the image or article, the way the publisher chose to place it, tells me something about the history or about that particular moment in history. So I do always think of this question all the time. On the one hand, I am digitizing and converting these articles, these publications into digital format. On the other hand, I do run the risk of losing other kinds of valuable information. And so I'm going to agree with Estelle that these are not these options should not supplement each other or replace each other, but should go always together. So I always would like to be able to have access at least to the image of the original material, so that I can contextualize it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I'd add a little bit to that, a little bit between Estelle and Supan's position on that, which is that if when we digitize material, there's a lot of things that are there. There's a lot that's also lost, but there's a lot that's present in a digital image, digital avatar, digital surrogate of a document. But there's still the question about how working with that using a specific method impacts the way that what we're able to see. So in other words, the method, I mean, the digital object is required for the method to work, but the method itself embeds certain kinds of biases and certain kinds of outcomes, right? I mean, you can only see so far as the method takes you, and so there is, of course, changing from a particular method or particular approach and stepping back and using another method with the same digital object, of course. But then sometimes, and I think this has become obvious in the case of the work that Estelle and I have done with trying HTR on handwritten manuscripts, is that sometimes the method takes you into a certain understanding of an object that you have seen through its digital version that makes you want to go back to the original to understand if there's something which you have missed, right? So it's not just an either or, right? But it's sort of like we need both of those things sometimes to answer the kinds of complicated questions that we have as researchers.
Thank you. Yes, I see we have a comment from Carolina. Could I say that digital humanities is a correlation between technologies and human behavior? Carolina,
take that one. Well, I'll start off and say I think that actually technology is already human behavior in a way. It's kind of an automation of human behavior, right? The technologies or machines are things that are created by human beings to achieve certain goals. That's why we have a hammer, or that's why we have a fork, right? And so definitely part of digital humanities is not just applying a tool to an object because we can, right? But knowing what the tool does and then understanding as we go throughout the effect that that tool actually has upon our materials, right? I mean, so there's a kind of a knowledge, a human knowledge of how we are changing the systems or changing knowledge by dint of using those various tools. So certainly human behavior or human knowledge is like embedded inside of technology, just like it's embedded inside of the ways that we use technology to understand the world that we live in.
David, that's a great answer. Human mistakes are also embedded within that technology. So yeah, absolutely.
Did I see a raised hand? I saw a raised hand and then, okay, Oscar, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, hi. Thank you all for your for this workshop. It's been amazing. I see that everybody's well versed in the technology like realm. So currently I'm doing like oral history research, and like I have been experiencing like a lot of transcribing. Well, I have had some experience with some transcribing, but a lot of the like programs that help with transcription are kind of not great. And I've been dealing with some like bilingual transcripts. So like, do you guys have any suggestions, or like, can you guys help me or guide me towards like a good transcribing program? Because like right now I have like an almost 3-hour-long oral history interview, and I'm not sure, you know, so if you guys could help me.
So I'll tell you, Oscar, that in the class that I'm teaching right now, we're working with speech-to-text algorithms. So we're working with bilingual, and not bilingual, we're working with texts which are being spoken by different speakers of English, right? To see how they respond, right? And so again, we're really, you know, looking straight into the eye of the storm here. We're realizing that when you give such algorithms to people, or you direct them to the speech of certain people, that they sometimes, if it's just English, it doesn't understand it, right? There are moments where the English is not, and that has to do a little bit, or a lot, actually, I'm sure, with what Supan brought up about the way that models are trained, or what Carol also brought this up. If you train automatic transcription of speech systems on certain voices, certain privileged voices in a society, what you end up with is an algorithm that understands those privileged voices, right? And doesn't quite get the other thing. Now, you've introduced a really interesting second question in your or second dimension in the question that you asked, which is that of a second language. What happens when people code switch, for example? It's a really hard one. I don't know any. I know there were some linguists who worked with, I'm trying to think of what the name of the tool was, for human markup, right, of that kind of work. I'm not aware of automatic transcription that understands when someone code switches, right? I guess the way that I would imagine that you have to do it is to divide up the transcripts that you have, and then effectively kind of apply the appropriate algorithm at the right perspective, but that doesn't help from the perspective of automation, right? So that's a great question. I don't really know where to start. I think Supan could answer a little bit about, like, imagine that you had a text and there were multiple directions in the text, right? Or imagine that you had different parts of the page, one which had a right to left language, for example, and the other that had a left to right language, right? And then you were trying to decide for which part does one actually apply what algorithm such that it works. Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't have any answer for you there.
Yeah, I have, unfortunately, no answer for Oscar as well. I have actually no experience in, text to speech to text algorithms. But one general observation about this kind of questions is, again, based on my experience of working with Ottoman Turkish, as David pointed out, which is written from right to left because it's in Arabic script, and the transcription output that I would like to be able to generate is left to right in Latin script, which creates a lot of complications. And many of the digital humanities tools or digital tools are really created with or for Western European languages or very large languages with commercial interest or some sort of infrastructure and investment on the part of government behind them. So there is practically, for example, no tool for Ottoman Turkish, either for digitization or for rendering it computer readable. What I figured out so far is that the best you can do is to come up with your own hacks, or to develop workarounds to make the tools that are already available, but they won't necessarily work for your material. You try to figure out ways to make it work, which tends to, you know, work, take some extra time or effort. But I mean, I imagine, you know, it is one thing to demand the Transcribus team to, you know, develop something that will work only for Ottoman Turkish, which is doable, but is going to take a lot of time and effort and manpower. On the other hand, you know, we can, and we did actually try to figure out to make it work ourselves, and it worked out all right. So it does require some extra time, especially the language you are working with is not one of the, you know, Western European languages or major languages. But there are ways to make these kind of things work sometimes.
Thank you so much.
Also a question, Oscar, when you deal with something like this, is how much effort you actually want to make to find a solution for something based on how much of it you actually have to accomplish, right? So if, for example, someone's, you have a recording and there's code switching and that code switching is every 2 minutes for extended, you know, for extended periods, and you have hundreds and hundreds of hours, that's something where maybe you want to focus on your attention on trying to find a solution for it, right? Trying to find a hack. But if there's just a few portions of the text which are actually making, you know, causing difficulty, it might just be better in such a situation to just do it yourself, right? So it's kind of, it is really a question of scale. You know, transcription by hand, manual transcription is not fun, but if it's really just a tiny piece that isn't really clouding the larger picture of what you're working on, then you know, maybe a manual solution is the right one. This, of course, doesn't solve the problem for society, right? Because society has a problem of not having algorithms that work for all the people that live in society, right? That's not, so the hack is not a solution, right, to a larger problem. It's just it's kind of a little, as Supan suggested, a little tiny workaround, right, in the moment that gets you to the next step of your work.
Thank you again.
Are there any other questions? I'm just looking at the time. We're about 38 minutes past, and I don't know, I guess we're coming up against, we were supposed to finish about 40 minutes. I guess what I'd like to suggest that we do, first of all, besides thanking all of the participants for their really interesting and insightful comments in our presentations today and in the breakout rooms, it's really from communities of people that really in the trenches, is that people who are really working and carrying out research. And in carrying out research in really different cultural horizons and in different languages. We don't get an opportunity, you know, to be with so many people at the same time who are doing that. So the comments that you made have been really very insightful and really provocative for us as a group. So I'd first of all just like to thank you for that. I'd like to, I guess, give the floor to my co-presenters. If anyone else has anything they'd like to say, or just to wrap things up, and I think we can probably pass back to the ICA team after that. But Beth, Carol, Estelle, Supan, is there anything you'd like to add to wrap up?
I just want to take. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Supan.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Carol. I wanted to thank the ICA team one more time for organizing this, and it is an audience that, like David pointed out, that I don't always get to engage with or hear from. So it was really an excellent learning experience for me as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
I just want to echo my two co-participants here for in their thanks, both to the organization for having us today and to all of you for making this such a valuable valuable morning on this end of the world. But thank you.
Great. So we hope that at some point in the future, our paths will cross at the Winter Institute. Hopefully, inshallah, we'll be there in person next year. Keep an eye on our website. We also have, if you remember, our mailing list, if you'd like to be on it. I really thank everybody for being here today. And I'm going to pass to Margaret. Can I pass to you, Margaret?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, David, and Carol and Supan and Beth and Estelle. I've been present throughout all of this workshop, and it was really excellent and a lovely balance of pace and contrast. I thought it worked incredibly well, and I thought you got a lot of participation from the class, and I'd like to say thank you to the class as well, the individuals who attended. I have put the evaluation survey link in the chat. You'll also be getting a follow-up email with it. It won't take you very long to fill it out, but we'd be really grateful if you could do that, because the feedback is really helpful for us in organising workshops in the future. And stay in touch, and I hope that this is the beginning of a relationship between the digital humanities scholars and custodians out there with ICA. And I think I just want to echo the value of the truly international perspectives that ICA certainly is in a good position to support, hopefully. So thanks everyone. When you're free to go when you're ready.
Thanks so
Bye,
much,
everyone.
everyone.
Very nice to meet you all.
Thank you.